you have said that Britain must take its fair share of refugees. How big is the fair share?
Germany has taken over 200,000 refugees. We've taken a very small number. Indeed, the total number of refugees coming into Britain last year was only 20,000. I can't put a figure on it, but I think we should take a considerable number, and we should recognise that Europe as a whole, particularly the southern countries of Europe, are taking a very large number of refugees and not getting enough support to cope with their needs.
Should it be proportional? If we are 10% of Europe's population, should we take 10% of the refugees?
Well, normal refugee programmes are normally run through the United Nations and normally have an agreed system of quotas. The problem with Britain is that the Home Secretary rejected a UN-organised system for refugees last year from Syria, and instead we have this rather complicated situation we're in now. But I think there has to be a coming together of European countries recognising there is a crisis. We've all got to play our part in it. It's a humanitarian crisis.
Yvette Cooper, you said 10,000 could be done in a month. Is that 10,000 every month? So 120,000 in a year? Or is it 10,000 as a one-off?
It depends on how many local councils come forward to offer. And already, since I called for action this morning, I've had councillors and people coming forward and saying they want to do something to help. What I've said is, look, if every local council, if every city across the country took 10 refugee families, well, that would add up to nearly 10,000 places for people who are vulnerable refugees who are fleeing conflict and persecution. In the end, the final number would depend on what communities came forward to do.
So
I think that's the best way. Well, I think that actually when you ask people, actually they do want to come forward. There's been this assumption that actually local councils, that local communities don't want to help. There's been this assumption that because everybody's so troubled about immigration, therefore nobody wants to help on asylum and refugees. And it is just not true. And that is why I think if we work together across the country, rather than just trying to play each other off against each other, actually you could get very strong support to help people, just as we did in with the kinder transport.
Surely it's for the government to decide the total number.
Well, I think the government should start by asking local councils and communities to come forward.
Okay.
At the moment, the government is saying none. The government is doing nothing to help, refusing to take anybody from the Mediterranean, refusing to take more than a few hundred from Syria, even though millions and millions of people have lost their homes in Syria. And I just think this is a humanitarian crisis, the greatest we have seen since the Second World War. We have to act. We cannot turn our backs. But actually, if we do so together, I think you will find there is considerably more interest in supporting the refugees than anybody has given Britain credit for.
Andy Burnham, who should decide? Should this be done by agreement with the rest of Europe, or is it just a unilateral decision by Britain or by local councils?
No, I think it should be done by agreement, working together across the European Union to make sure there's fairness, and the countries that are able to take more do take them. I think we're all agreed on this. I made a call at the weekend for the government to show leadership, because quite honestly, where have they been all summer? You know, where have they been as this crisis has been unfolding across the continent? And my argument is, if they were to play a part in helping deal with this situation, perhaps then they get a better hearing when it comes to EU migration and the changes they want to see there. You know, instead we've just seen a government that's tried to push the situation away, actually is worse, used language like a swarm of migrants, you know, trying to use this as a kind of dog whistle style politics. It's completely and utterly wrong. And the government, I think, this summer have been found completely wanting as this tragedy is unfolding.
So it should be proportional. Germany's going to take 800,000 people in this year. You think Britain should take something proportional?
I'm saying by agreement
with
across the European Union. Of course, Britain is outside of the Schengen area, so we operate to a different set of standards when it comes to immigration. But that's not the point.
Any idea how many it is?
The point is, as this crisis unfolds, you cannot let Greece particularly shoulder the burden, give all the problems that the Greek people and the Greek government are facing. There has to be a European approach here where everybody agrees to play their part.
Liz Kendall, how many people should Britain take? Nobody's actually giving me an answer.
Well, actually,
on terms of numbers.
I have started talking about numbers and been the first person to do so. So
10,000 in a month. What about next month or the month after?
Well, it's 10,000 is the places that people could offer. But I think, again, you know, you want councils to come forward to do as much as they possibly can.
I think that Yvette makes a very strong point here that if you were currently leader of the Labour Party or Prime Minister of the country, you would be asking for a plan that is workable within the country. And I agree that there are many local councils and council leaders who would be prepared to play their part. And David Cameron should be asking local councils what they're able to do and putting that forward across Europe as part of a negotiation, because we have to do more than we're doing at the moment. I think we can take thousands.
But it shouldn't be a straight proportional number.
No, because I think
we're 10%, so we should take 10%.
How you come up with any decent solution is making sure you've got the resources to cope and the willingness to put a scheme in place, and that you negotiate with your neighbours. But there's more we also need to be doing to make sure that when people arrive in places like Greece, that they are properly assessed. We aren't putting the money in there either. There's far more we should be doing, not just in terms of taking refugees in this country, but making sure countries like Greece and Italy have the resources they need to assess people who are
So nobody
travelling.
will top Yvette Cooper's 10,000. Do any of you think we should take more than 10,000?
The question is also to ensure that local authority areas that welcome refugees, and I hope they all do, also get central government funding in order to accommodate them and all the other needs that go with it. But it's also a question of Europe pushing the whole issue back. I mean, there's dreadful scenes today in Hungary where there's thousands of refugees trying to get on trains and not being allowed to. They're going to be pushed back over the border into Serbia, according to the Hungarian government. It's a pretty disgraceful set of situations where you've got desperate people being pushed around. The British government should intervene.
You've hit
It's an
on
arbitrary question, isn't it? Because we don't know, of course, how many people will continue to arrive. But the bigger point I'm making is this could be a moment for Britain to show leadership so that we can get changes elsewhere in terms of immigration policy, particularly when it comes to EU migration. And they haven't shown that leadership. I think there are councils across the country who will be prepared to take people in.
Well,
let's make this an argument for what the change we want to see on
Let's talk about immigration more broadly then.
Just before you
Are
do,
there
Krishnan, just
hang on.
before you do, because you've asked for disagreement between us. Actually, what I was calling for this morning was agreement, for us not to simply be dividing us between us, and also calling on other political parties to support this call as well, to support the government to do so, and other parties across the country.
Let's go to
we
immigration
actually have
more
to build up a
broadly.
consensus on this rather than try to divide everybody.
Let's go to immigration more broadly. You, at the beginning of your campaigns, both of you, talked about immigration as a real problem on the doorstep.
Yeah.
Are there too many people coming into Britain? Is 300,000 net too many?
Well, I spoke about the way European migration works because I think the communities that get most affected are often places where housing is cheapest, where there are fewest jobs. You know, they shoulder a real burden. People's wages can be undercut. You can see pressure on public services. And at the moment, those communities are forgotten. They don't get any extra money from Westminster or Brussels to deal with it. And if politicians just say immigration's a good thing, people living in those areas will think, well, hang on a minute, our community is changing, we're not getting any help. No, I'm not arguing against free movement. You know, Theresa May made proposals at the weekend that would affect millions of British people if they had to have a job to go to. You know, this would have a big impact in terms of the way free movement works. I've never said we should change that. What I do say is free movement shouldn't mean freedom to claim. And we do need restrictions on people's access to social housing, to benefits. These changes need to be made, and I'm saying today that the government might be better placed to get those changes if it cooperated to deal with the refugee
Jeremy
crisis.
Corbyn, would you restrict their benefits when they arrive?
I think restricting benefits is really the wrong agenda to go down. If people are here and working and paying taxes, then surely they have a right to benefits just like anybody else does. The other point is on the numbers, 177,000 of those were actually students coming here to study, paying into the economy, working maybe at the end of their course and going back, or maybe not. 25,000 of that figure were also asylum seekers last year, which is actually a low figure by European standards. The way in which the government have deliberately presented the figures and the way in which some of the popular press have deliberately presented the figures is actually wholly misleading.
It's wrong to limit their benefits, Liz Kendall.
I think immigration is one of the toughest issues for the country and for our party. And the truth is, there isn't a simple, single soundbite solution
to that point about whether it's right or wrong to limit immigrants' benefits.
Without doubt, I believe in the contributory principle that you should pay in before you take out. And the truth is that many people...
This is a difference.
How can they pay?
Krishnan, I think this is a difference.
Like
I don't think Jeremy's view will win back voters that Labour has lost who feel that they're not listened to on this subject. I think people see this as a basic point of fairness. Yeah, come to work, but contribute before you claim. That is the way most people would think about this
This is an
issue.
implicit criticism of Yvette Cooper's record as Shadow Home Secretary.
Actually, it seems to be the policy that we put forward at the election. I think it's exactly the same.
Are you saying Labour got it all right?
No, I was one of those calling for a long time for changes in this area because I felt for a long time people in Labour areas were leaving us because I personally feel we didn't act quickly enough on it.
Did you
it's been
disagree
there
with
for
any
a
of the
long
policies
time.
that we had at the time of the election?
Well, No, but I don't think you necessarily believed in those either. You know, the 2-year restriction was a debate that went on, and I think the party took some time to get there. You know, we got there right at the end of the last Parliament, and I think we left too long. We looked like we weren't serious about dealing with the issue, responding to people's legitimate concerns. Labour people were left avoiding people's eyes on the doorstep. We had a document that said, if the subject comes up on the doorstep, close it down and move on. That wasn't the right response, Yvette. It really wasn't.
I think we have an agreement that this is a serious issue. I just think, actually, Andy's policy proposals are exactly the same ones that we had at the time of the general election. Now, look, you know, that's important because what we should have is a system that is controlled and managed so that it's fair. You know, immigration is really important to Britain and will be to our future, but the system's got to be one that people can have confidence in. That's why actually the strongest thing I've argued for is to action against the exploitation of low-skilled migration, which undercuts pay and jobs. It is deeply unfair and ends up causing huge problems, and it's unfair as well on employers who are responsible and who want to pay a fair wage. So I actually think we could go much further and make that exploitation a crime, and that would help support the legitimacy of the migration system.
The truth is
right
that people
about
live, work and study all over the world much more than they did in the past. And there is a real risk that we end up sounding like we think we can simply pull up the drawbridge and hope the rest of the world goes away. We need to do far more to take on some of the myths that there are. You know, you're far more likely to be treated by somebody in the NHS who's non-British than to be queuing behind them. There are some real issues about skills, both the basic level of skills in this country and the higher level of skills that businesses are still having to employ people to come in to do in the
All of that is true, Liz.
But
It's
we
far
have
more
to have
fairness
that.
in terms of the way immigration works.
Just
People
finally
don't
on
feel
this,
it's fair at the moment.
Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, would you put any restrictions in to reduce the number of people coming into Britain?
Well,
Or,
there are
you know,
restrictions anyway already. The only free movement is for Europeans. The only way non-Europeans can come in is either on a work visa or if they're very wealthy or if it's a family reunion case. The amount of immigration, net immigration, is actually very small.
Fine.
And net immigrants as a whole are net contributors to the economy. And Yvette's right about the level of exploitation of migrant work, migrant labour.
Is about treating immigration and asylum as the same thing. At a time when we've got this huge refugee crisis, which is where this debate started, actually you have to separate out immigration and asylum.
Well, let's talk about
otherwise
the
we will do the wrong thing.
Of some of this refugee crisis, which right now is Syria. Yvette Cooper, if you were the leader of the Labour Party and David Cameron comes to you and says, I need your backing for military action against ISIS in Syria, what's your response?
I think there's some very big questions the Prime Minister will have to answer. We obviously already have military intervention in Iraq because we're there at the request of a democratically elected Iraqi government who has asked for our help. They are the ground troops trying to hold off the barbarism of ISIL and trying to defend their democracy. So it's clear in Iraq what the objectives are and what role we are playing.
What's your preconditions then?
Well, I think in Syria, the questions are, what are the actual objectives? Who are the ground troops? When you have Assad rather than a democratically elected government, what are you trying to achieve? There's a big question about the other role of other countries around the region. There's also a question about making sure that any proposal is legal, any proposal is proportionate and has clear objectives.
So let's assume
I think those questions,
to all of that.
Well,
it is conceivable that you could back military action against Syria.
I think you have to look very seriously at any proposal, and for that reason we have supported, and I think rightly so, the action in Iraq at the request of the democratically elected government. But I think in Syria, I just think it's too early. You have to have the Prime Minister put forward those questions, and we can't speculate. Being honest about the seriousness of this, we cannot speculate until the Prime Minister has answered those questions.
Liz Kendall?
Well, without doubt, there would have to be a clear rationale for what UK troops would contribute over and above what the US is already doing there, and it would have to be part of a wider strategy in the region. I think the Prime Minister has been correct to say we're in a generational struggle against ISIL, but we haven't seen a commensurate strategy in response for dealing with what's happening, the schism between Sunni and Shia in the region, understanding how ISIL are still getting their money, who they're selling oil to. It's got to be part of something far broader, because if anybody thinks that bombing Syria alone will be the solution to the problems we face there, is profoundly
But it's possible. We're all sort of... nobody's ruling it out so far. You wouldn't rule it out either, would you?
No, absolutely not ruling it out, Krishnan. But Labour has to learn the lessons of the last decade and certainly the lessons of Iraq. So the legality of any action is a major question, particularly when as Yvette just said, the Syrian government isn't making an invitation, isn't asking for our support. So the
you wouldn't have gone
has
to Kosovo?
to answer that question. They have to answer that first.
You wouldn't have gone to Kosovo, which didn't pass the
I'm just
legal
saying
test,
you have to answer that question in terms of the legality. But
well, just answer that point, though. I mean, you're saying legality is paramount. Kosovo didn't pass the legal test. Would you have gone to Kosovo?
Massive different, completely different situations. So I don't think it's right to just draw that direct parallel. But what I am saying is, I wouldn't rule it out. But a proposition has to be put. Time has to be allowed for careful consideration to be given. Talk of this vote being brought the first week that Parliament is back is disrespectful to the country, to be honest, to bounce the opposition in that kind of way.
Are there any circumstances, Jeremy Corbyn, in which you could imagine backing airstrikes in Syria?
I find it very hard to see them, and I'll give you the reason why. The Foreign Secretary made quite an interesting remark last week during his visit to Tehran for the reopening of the embassy, which is good news. He said that now that Iran is back within a degree of an orbit, there is an opportunity now for a serious political initiative across the whole region, which could unite an awful lot of people against what ISIL are doing. The point that Liz was making about their oil sales, their arms imports and their money. What is actually being done to cut all that off? What pressure has been put on the Turkish government, who, whilst claiming to go into Syria to bomb ISIL positions, appeared to be more interested in bombing Kurdish positions there. So I do think there is some possibility of political movements. But if we start bombing, you're going to kill people. If it doesn't work, you're going to send in ground troops. You're going to send in ground troops. Who are you in alliance with when you're sending those ground troops in? It could be
you're in
even worse.
Assad, realistically, aren't you?
Well, or you're with the Free Syrian Army, or if there's a ceasefire between Assad and the Free Syrian Army, do you support the Kurdish people against them? And so it's not a two-way civil war.
So you think it would always make it worse?
I think it's at least four-way civil war. I don't see how it could make it any better, because you end up with destruction, of course. You end up with civilian deaths, of course. What's that message across the region? Does that actually, to some people, make ISIL an even more attractive operation, or do we try and contain them and cut them off, as I think is the burden of what Liz was saying a moment ago?
You see, I mean, Yvette Cooper, Jeremy Corbyn famously said that if Tony Blair has committed war crimes, he should be prosecuted. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think, look, I don't think we should just rush to judgment when we haven't had the Chilcot report out. And that's the whole point of the Chilcot report, is in order to look into what happened with Iraq and what happened very many years ago. And it's right, we should do so. I think, just sort of making these sweeping political statements, I think, is not helpful.
I did say if.
Yeah, I think it's not there.
If the war was illegal, yes?
If there's a charge against anyone on this, then they must face it. If there is a charge, but
Andy
at the
Burnham,
moment there is.
that you as Labour leader could support the prosecution of Tony Blair if the Chilcot report finds that the war was illegal?
We have to wait to see what the Chilcot report says. This was an intense period in our country's history when decisions were taken in the aftermath of the attack on the World Trade Center, Afghanistan. I mean, it's easy for people to sit here today and say, oh, it was all so easy, and that people knowingly misled people, because that is basically what is being said.
But you're not
I don't believe that to be the case, having lived through that period in time. There was a widespread view that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. There was. And also, there were appeals from the Iraqi Kurds to liberate them from the oppressive regime of Saddam. And if we hadn't have taken action, of course, he would have remained in place for many years. This is a more complex issue. It's easy for people to sit here today and make pronouncements of the kind we've just heard.
But I think you need to wait for... You have to wait for that Chilcot report. You're not saying it's inconceivable?
Well, I think...
But you as Labour leader could support the prosecution of Tony Blair.
You are implying by saying it that people knowingly misled people, and I don't believe that to be the case.
The next Labour leader has got to lead our party out of the shadow of Iraq. I think it has prevented us from having a sensible debate about Britain's role in the world and a future foreign policy at precisely the time when David Cameron has overseen a quiet diminishing of Britain's role in the world. And this Chilcot report needs to come out as soon as possible, and then we have to have a debate about
on the back of it,
what is a progressive political party's vision of the world and our foreign policy.
Agreed.
Because we have not seen that under David Cameron. We are seeing him withdraw from the world, and believe that Britain's role is a series of bilateral economic negotiations with different countries threatening to pull us out of Europe. And that cannot happen because what happens elsewhere has a deep effect on us in this country, and we have to move on from what happened in Iraq.
Two of the people around this table have not ruled out supporting the prosecution of Tony Blair. What do you make of that?
I do not believe that people were knowingly misled about weapons of mass destruction. I wasn't an MP at the time, and I have never criticised those who had to make those decisions because they were there and I was not. But without doubt, we have to have a day of reckoning as a party with what happened in Iraq and move on, because the world is a risky, unstable, dangerous place, and we on the left have to have a vision for a future foreign policy.
I recall a very long meeting with Hans Blix after the decision had been taken in Parliament. A lot of MPs were there, and he said categorically that he was 90% sure there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That proved to be the case. He had made that case both to the French President Chirac and to Tony Blair on successive days. Chirac accepted his word on it and decided he would not support intervention in Iraq. Tony Blair rejected his word on it and decided to support intervention on Iraq.
But that's why the whole point of the Chilcot report is in order to look at everything that happened. We know that there weren't weapons of mass destruction when we thought there were. Many of us thought there were. We know that it drew resources from Afghanistan at a critical point in the conflict. We also know that there were huge problems with the post-conflict planning. So we know that there were a series of things that went wrong. But actually the whole point about the Chilcot inquiry is to do the detail. And it is very serious that it is just dragged on.
And I think it's wrong, actually, to anybody involved to rush to judgment now and make statements now about what people did or didn't do. I think that is actually unfair.
And I think there is also an important difference between what happened in Iraq and what is happening now in Iraq, where you have a democratically elected government. And I think that may be actually a difference between Jeremy and I now, is I think Jeremy was probably not support for the democratically elected Iraqi government now. And I do think we do need to support them in their battle against ISIS.
I want to move this on a little bit.
Is another example.
I want to move this on a little bit to foreign policy more broadly. This weekend, we saw a repetition of the Conservative attack on a possible Corbyn Labour Party as a threat to national security, referring to unilateral nuclear disarmament and a desire to leave NATO. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn would be a threat to our national security?
Well, we just disagree on this. I mean, I'm a multilateralist and not a unilateralist. I don't think unilateralism is the right approach for Britain.
So he would be?
So I think the right thing for our national security is to have a multilateralist approach. We should be trying to reduce nuclear weapons across the globe, and we should also stay as part of NATO.
Right, so would he be a threat to Britain's national security?
I don't think it's right for us to pull out of NATO. I don't think that would be the right thing, not just for Britain's security, but also for wider internationalism. We're an internationalist party. We've always been so. We should always stay so.
What would the consequence be of having the wrong policy? Would it mean our national security was threatened?
I think the problem for us, the problem with NATO would actually be the impact it would have on Eastern European countries, for whom being part of NATO and having the backing of NATO is immensely important to them and their sense of security, particularly where there's such sort of uncertainty about the way in which Putin responds, about the way in which Russia responds. So that's why I think we should be part of NATO, not simply because of us and because of Britain, but it's actually about our responsibility across Europe and across the world, and it's part of that internationalism rather than simply a kind of simplistic statement about the UK.
Jeremy Corbyn, if there were Russian tanks rolling through Lithuania, what would you do?
Well, they're not rolling through Lithuania, and I would hope they're not going to be, and I would hope also we would, instead of waiting for that day to happen, I hope it never does, we would instead start some serious negotiations with Russia about trying to demilitarize all of the boundaries between the Eastern European countries that have been recruited to NATO, Ukraine, which is not yet in NATO, and the Russian troops that are on the border. I mean,
we currently have an obligation to them under NATO, don't we? So if it were to happen, would you honour it?
Well, if you're a NATO member, then of course you're immediately sucked into it. My point about NATO is that obviously in the long term there has to be a serious discussion about Britain's strategic defence role. The government is having an SDR. I think Labour should have a strategic defence review as well. My worry about NATO is a couple of things. One is it requires us all to spend 2% of GDP on defence expenditure. Secondly, David Cameron's view, which he pushed at the last NATO summit, was expanding into a sort of series of affiliated members of NATO, all of which, under the NATO Charter, can drag us into a whole series of conflicts elsewhere. Surely we need to be looking at a world where you try and de-escalate, not escalate military tensions. Now, I'm not a supporter of Putin, Russian expansion, or anybody else's expansion, but I do think that Russian expansion provokes NATO, and so on and so on, and you end up with something that's actually quite dangerous. And so,
you actually said that it was NATO that had, provoked Russia.
No, I didn't. I said that one thing provokes another, and I thought that
You said they had not been
I thought that
by NATO, which I assumed to mean provoked by NATO.
Excessive and obsessive expansion since 1990 has been a problem. In 2006, NATO changed its whole...
Russia's expansion.
Can I finish? NATO changed its whole charter. It was based on the Atlantic Charter in 1942 of Churchill and Roosevelt. The idea was it was a North Atlantic arrangement. 1948, NATO is founded. It's a Cold War machine. 1990, end of Cold War, end of Warsaw Pact. NATO didn't end. It carried on.
But why do you spend so much time criticising NATO rather than what Russia's doing?
NATO is then trying to expand, and it then, in 2006, gave itself a global role. We could potentially be involved in conflicts anywhere in the world. My view is we should argue quite strongly in NATO for a more realistic view of what its role is, and also why and where it's trying to expand and for what purpose.
Just to clarify,
we are ending up with a new Cold War here.
Do you think Russia was provoked or not?
I think the Russian military and industrial connections used the opportunity to push their government, and one thing feeds off the other. I don't say it's all the fault of NATO. It's also a responsibility. It's also the response of Russian nationalism. Surely, in this day and age, are we heading for a new Cold War? And it looks like it, or are we going to actually say, hang on a minute, there's got to be some arrangement? Now, Ukraine had a neutrality...
to me, though,
Andy, if I can finish, Andy. If I can finish, I know, but I want to finish, if I may, if I'm very kind.
Briefly, if you will, and then we'll
1993, Ukraine developed into itself a neutrality agreement, non-nuclear role, and then it was encouraged to accept NATO troops and NATO presence there. I think that was a bit of a problem.
Andy Burnham.
If you want my opinion, it sounds like you're making excuses for Putin there.
No, I'm not, Andy.
It sounds like it, Jeremy.
Andy, that is
no, it sounds like it. You're saying that he was kind of prompted and provoked into doing what he did in Ukraine.
You know it.
Nobody makes you annex.
It sounded a little bit like it, because there's been an act of aggression here.
Andy, when have I ever made excuses?
Let him finish.
Well, I was listening carefully. You said NATO kind of put pressure on Russian forces, then subsequently put pressure on Putin. I don't think that is what happened. We've seen an international breach here in terms of the sovereignty of a country, and we shouldn't make excuses for that.
Can you persuade Jeremy Corbyn why Britain needs nuclear weapons?
Because in this day and age, in the world as it is right now, the uncertainty, the unpredictability that we face, now is not the time to break international partnerships. Now is not the time, in my view, to drop our defences as a country. Now is the time for leadership, for clarity, and to stand firm and to stand for what we believe in. And I personally believe you need to work through international partnerships. Internationalism should be our approach as a party. We shouldn't be talking about leaving NATO. We shouldn't be talking about leaving the European Union. That's our approach as a party. We should be proud of our internationalist tradition.
Which partnership requires us to have nuclear weapons? Well, which partnership requires it?
Well, of
Jeremy,
course,
there are sadly, the evidence...
Jeremy, we are where we are.
There are no partnerships
we are
where
we are, and I'm
weapons.
saying to you that if Britain was to go it alone now and take a decision on its own, unilaterally, to disarm, my judgment is that doesn't make us safer.
Yvette Cooper,
briefly. Can I just finish on that point? Because sadly, the evidence around Putin is that he doesn't just back off in response to soft power. The evidence, sadly, on Putin is that, in the end, it needs firm security response in order for him to back off. And I wish that wasn't the case. I really wish it was the case that we were dealing with, you know, a nice, benign state and benign leader that would have those rational discussions. But sadly, the evidence has proved that's not been the case.
You think he's being naive when it comes to
I
Putin?
think the reality is that you have to have a firm response and be confident in the partnerships and the security partnerships that you need in dealing in an uncertain world with somebody like Putin.
Just lastly, on foreign policy, before we come home, you have criticised the company Jeremy Corbyn has kept with regard to homophobia and anti-Semitism. Can you spell out what it is you think he's done wrong?
Let's be very clear. I am not criticising Jeremy's values in any way or anything that Jeremy thinks. I think this is purely about having a responsibility to think about, if you're inviting people to appear on platforms with you, the signal that it sends out, and being very clear to always distance ourselves and the Labour Party from extremism, from anti-Semitism and from homophobic abuse. I am not criticising Jeremy's values, and I would just, you know, make that
But he was
point.
wrong to share a platform.
But I think I just don't think you should share platforms with people who pursue abuse.
Jeremy Corbyn.
You have to talk to people if you're going to make progress. You have to oppose anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, far-right racism all the time, and we all do all the time. You're not going to bring about a Middle East peace process unless Israel negotiates with both Hamas and Fatah, and everybody knows that. And indeed, Israel is already been in talks with Hamas through the proximity talks in Cairo. Indeed, I hesitate to quote him, but Tony Blair has actually met Hamas far more times than I have.
But talks are right. It's a good thing to have talks. There's a difference
well,
between
okay.
talks
always think
and
that
having
there shouldn't be
platforms
a-
that give people the chance to promote their
There
views
shouldn't be a bar
and
on
then
anyone you
licensing
talk
and
to. I mean,
legitimising them.
You congratulated on Twitter Ken Livingstone for not sharing a platform with the BNP. Would you share a platform with the BNP?
No, of course not. Well,
So you wouldn't share a platform with the BNP, but you would with the people you have?
I have talked to people about the Middle East issues with yes, I've spoken to Hamas. Indeed, I met Hamas in the company of a large number of members of Parliament from the British Parliament and parliaments all across Europe in their role as the elected government of Gaza. Does that mean we agree with all the policies of the elected government of Gaza? Absolutely not. Does it mean one wants to try and bring about a process which will end the siege of Gaza, which will end the ghastly situation that many Palestinian people are living in? Yes. And do many Israeli people agree with what we're saying on that? Absolutely yes.
OK.
There are many who do.
We're going to move on to domestic policy. Andy Burnham, food banks often now say that the biggest reason people come to them is because they've had their benefits sanctioned. This is a process that began under the Labour government. Would you reverse that?
I think we need a big debate and review of the way benefits policy is working in this country. I think the way this government has taken those reforms but really driven them hard, sanctioning people for being minutes late for a job interview, it's just wrong. They're driving people to despair. And worse, we
but
found
this
out last
began
week
under Labour.
that people, well, you know, they've tried to claim that every policy that they're introducing began under us. Well, it's not the case.
Would you put it in reverse, is the question?
Yes, I would.
Not would you have a
yes,
review?
I would. I think there need to be big changes to the Department of Work and Pensions. I think they're operating a dehumanised, punitive, sanctions-based regime that is actually not helping people get their lives turned around and is driving people to despair. And we heard last week, actually, Krishnan, people past fit for work have subsequently died. I mean, doesn't that tell you something is seriously wrong with the way this system is working? I believe it does.
But would you cut the welfare bill within that?
I think we need to have Labour solutions to cutting the welfare bill. The amount this country spends on housing benefit, let me just make this point, is huge. And its roots are in the original right to buy, where we have a country now that is overly reliant on the private rented sector, where housing benefit is paid out in millions of pounds to absent landlords who rake in the money and don't put that money back into the upkeep of their properties. It's completely wrong. I would free councils to build affordable homes so that we can move people out of private rented accommodation.
Liz Kendall, is the welfare bill too big?
I do want to see the welfare bill come down. It's not right that over the last Parliament, 95% of government spending on housing went on housing benefit. and not building homes.
So you
We
would keep
spend
cutting?
I would reform welfare
Well,
because...
reform is a cut when you're bringing the bill down,
No,
isn't
it's
it?
not. A reform is to make it work so that we do not have a work programme that is sending more people on ESA back to the job centre than is finding work. We have £30 billion a year spent on tax credits subsidising low pay rather than giving people the skills they need to get high-wage jobs. And welfare is a huge issue for us as a party. One of the reasons why we lost the election was because people thought that we weren't serious about welfare. We thought the solution was just to keep spending our way out of problems. But we have yet to set out a different Labour approach to welfare reform that will give people the skills they need to get jobs and provide decent, dignified support for those who can't work.
Jeremy Corbyn, do you see this line of continuity between New Labour and welfare cuts under the Tories?
Yeah, there was a narrative in New Labour that was quite aggressive in its implementation of regulations, and that has got considerably worse. And last week, Ian Duncan-Smith was forced to publish the figures of the tragedies, the number of people that have died whilst being sanctioned on benefits, which is truly frightening. And Liz is right. We are ending up actually subsidising low wages and subsidising high rents.
Is she right that the welfare bill's too high?
She's right, we spend far too much on subsidising high rents and low wages. Therefore, you raise wages and you control private sector. It's private sector rents rather than council rents that are the issue here. But there's also a question of the numbers of people that are sanctioned, the numbers of people that fall through the net. Look around any city, the people that are sleeping rough, the people that are begging, the people that have been completely forgotten by the system, and they end up. And we've almost institutionalised charities and food banks to make up for the deficiencies of the welfare state. Can't we be proud of having a society in which there is a safety net that does prevent people falling into destitution?
What about fitness to work tests that have put the disabled back to work? Would you get rid of all of that?
I have huge problems with them. I've met so many people with disabilities who've been through fitness for work tests where they've been approved as fit for work. Clearly are not. Some are suffering mental health conditions. Some even commit suicide as a result of it. Most of them, I think, in fact, 60% win appeals on this. So if 60% of decisions are being overturned on appeal, there's something badly wrong with the decision-making in the first
Yvette
place.
Cooper, I mean, what this represents really is a pretty wholesale trashing of the New Labour approach to welfare, isn't it? Which you were part of.
Actually, I think it's a big criticism of what the government is doing. Because, look, you're right that you've always got to have assessments of whether or not people should be on sickness benefits or not. But actually, that is not what the government is doing. They've got targets for sanctions, targets that send to the job centre staff about the number of people they are supposed to penalise each month. I mean, that is just shocking and it is wrong. It's really damaging what they've done. And you've seen it, whether it's from the bedroom tax, whether it's the cuts to tax credits, which hit working families. You've got an awful lot of families.
But you would also cut benefits, wouldn't you? And you would cap them.
I think you've got to look for savings, of course, but do so as everybody, we all agree, I think, on this, about the problem about when you've got rising rents and actually much of this money is being given directly to private landlords. It's not actually making anybody better off. It's not lifting any kids out of poverty. It's not solving the problem.
If we were to blame, we'd have had food banks everywhere in Labour's, and we didn't, because we had a more humane benefits policy. This government has actively played politics with the lives of vulnerable people. And I think Labour needs to find its voice on this, actually. We're kind of cowering at times, not able to defend some people who...
because you abstained on the bill, isn't it?
Well, no, we didn't, actually. There was... I called for it to be opposed. We had a form of opposition. We didn't simply abstain. But, yeah, it wasn't good enough. And this is where Labour needs to find the courage of its convictions. And if things are wrong, we need to say so. Going forward, if I'm the leader, that is what we will do.
The problem with that,
Jeremy Corbyn,
but the problem with that form of opposition was that we accepted the benefit cap as 23,000 in London and 20,000 outside London. That benefit cap impinges dreadfully on people living in the private rented sector. It's leading to the social cleansing of cities, towns and cities all over Britain with relatively high-priced private rented in the central city areas, lower elsewhere. My constituency, like many others in London, you could take them all around the country, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow and so on, or is all leading to what is effectively the expulsion of people from central areas. That is the brutality of that cap. We've got to oppose this bill in its totality.
Right.
For what it's trying to do, it's trying to hurt the most vulnerable and weakest in our society.
Yvette Cooper, can you explain why Corbynomics doesn't make sense?
Well, I think the big difference between Jeremy and I think, is this idea that you can just print money to solve problems. Where we would agree is that we've got to have a clear Labour alternative to George Osborne's plan, which means cutting 40% from public services. That's way beyond anything you need to cut the deficit. That is about an ideology of austerity. However, I just think you cannot print money when the economy is growing in order to pay for infrastructure. It just means what you're actually really doing is you're pushing up borrowing, but you're also pushing up inflation. It has a big impact on the currency. We've got to have an alternative, but if it's not real and it's not credible, it just falls apart between your fingers and then you're letting people down.
The last Labour government put £385 billion worth of quantitative easing into the banks. The last Labour government also funded a great deal of public sector developments in schools and hospitals through private finance initiatives, which cost us 6 times the original investment in them. It's not a sensible way of funding any kind of capital development. What I'm suggesting, and it's a proposal, it's there for consideration, and it has been supported by a large number of economists, is we set up a national investment bank which will fund the investment in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, productive industry, a whole range of things. It would be funded, if appropriate, through quantitative easing, if not, through traditional government borrowing, but it would be a form of investment at an affordable rate rather than the unaffordable rate. The Japanese economy was flatlining for 10 years until they finally decided they had to produce quantitative easing in order to stimulate some growth. There is nothing wrong with using quantitative easing to stimulate growth. Better doing that for productive industry and infrastructure rather than giving it to the banks to play around with as they've been doing.
The economy is growing. It's growing now. Now, growth has been late. That's
by
certainly
1%.
true, but it is growing. So if you want to just print money when the economy is growing, that's just going to put up inflation. How are people going to think, well, where's this money coming from? Well, we just asked the bank to print some more money.
Yvette, how
it's not real.
Are you going to go back to PFI on the funding of public infrastructure? Hang on. Are you going to go back to PFI or are you going to go back to government borrowing in order to achieve growth? But you realise
your proposal is just like PFI on steroids to do quantitative easing for infrastructure. That is exactly what you are talking about.
If I may say so.
Seriously, this is not a way in which you can genuinely fund infrastructure. You're just saying, well, let the Bank of England just get the printing presses rolling in order to fund really important infrastructure. It's just not responsible, and it'll be ripped apart by economists.
We put 300 billion into the banks. I'm suggesting...
When in the middle of a financial crisis.
Yeah.
The economy was about to go off a cliff. The banks were going bust around us. We had jobs being lost. The economy was in a terrible state.
Hang on.
There's a big difference.
I wasn't opposed to it. What I was opposed to was the lack of control of those banks at the end of it. What we did was bring them into public ownership. We put the shares into a holding company, which Osborne is now selling off. Why didn't we get control of those banks and make RBS and all the others invest in productive industry, invest in infrastructure?
Will you ditch it when the economy is growing? Will you admit that quantitative easing should not be done when the economy is growing?
You might not need it then. If you need it, do it.
If you need it, so if the economy is growing...
You seem very concerned about QE.
Yeah, because I think this is really serious. You're going to push up inflation and end up with a lot of families unable to see their cost of living rise because you're being irresponsible with the money.
That we put there.
You've got to be able to set out a serious alternative, but it's got to be credible. It's got to be not dodgy economics.
It's a very serious alternative.
What this is illustrating very well is what happens after September the 12th. Because here we have 2 leading Labour Party members fundamentally at odds. And you basically agree with Yvette on this against Jeremy Corbyn.
I have other concerns with Jeremy's economic policy, like the threats with being part of Europe.
What happens afterwards? If Jeremy has won, does he get your loyalty?
We've got to unite this party is what happens. And there are things that Jeremy has said in this campaign that I agree with. We've disagreed on defence, and you heard that earlier, but on housing, I think he said things that I agree with. On education as well.
So there is common ground.
All of the people around this table have said things that I agree with in this campaign, and the important thing is that this party unites. Obviously, we are making our own pitch at this moment in time, but the people out there who are the public need a strong opposition. They need a Labour Party to unite. And that is what I will do. I will work to unite the Labour Party
Liz
coming
Kendall,
out of this.
Would you be as loyal to Jeremy Corbyn as he has been loyal to previous leaders?
Nice trick question there. I will always be loyal to the Labour Party, but let me say this. The fundamentals don't change. We lost the election because people didn't trust us on the economy or with their taxes, and because we didn't have a positive vision of a better life that most people could feel
So you would
part of.
retain your conscience and
They
your,
will remain,
your
and we have always
irreducible
won
core.
when people have trusted us on the economy and we have a vision for the future. And we're not saying go back to a world where, you know, the vast swathes of the economy are nationalised and, you know, claim that we should be reopening the coal mines. That won't
If he asks
work.
you to vote a
And
particular
this-
way, will you vote with him or will you vote with your conscience?
Well, on some issues, like, for example, our membership of the EU, if there's any suggestion that we wouldn't be voting yes for us to remain in the EU, I'd have to vote against that because I think it's so important for the future of for the country. But the basics don't change about why we lost and how we need to change to win again. That will remain over the next 5 years.
Yvette Cooper, you've also said you would go onto the backbenches if you don't win. Will you be loyal to him when it comes to Labour votes, or will you vote?
He hasn't won yet. You know, we've
No,
still
exactly.
got weeks to go.
If.
Lots of people are still making their
Liz
mind
makes
up.
an important point because there are an awful lot of people who actually haven't
They
voted
have-
yet. Actually, there are some
absolutely
people who haven't
right.
even had their ballots yet.
You have
so
said
there is a
you
long
wouldn't
way
stand
to
for
go
the shadow
in this,
cabinet.
and we've got to
So
keep
you've entertained-
campaigning in this leadership election.
I get what you're doing, but you have entertained this scenario in the past because you said you wouldn't go into the shadow cabinet. The question is, what kind of backbencher would you be? He voted against every Labour leader he's been under, including Michael Foot, probably. Would you?
I don't think
can't
it-
remember the summer of '83 that closely.
I don't think it's my style to vote against the Labour Party. I think 500 times, is it something like that Jeremy has
You
done? I
wouldn't do
don't think
that.
that is my style. Look, I want us to hold the Labour Party together. To be honest, I actually think the best way to hold the Labour Party together is around those core values. And it is, you know, it goes back to the dispute that Jeremy and I were saying. I mean, I'm urging Jeremy to support my arguments that we can oppose the 40% cuts, but we don't have to do it in a way that's dodgy. And if Jeremy shifts his policy, that would help us.
It is about holding the Labour Party together, but it is also about winning in 2020.
Yeah.
And the
Being
Tories,
strong enough to win the election. I agree with
are
that.
determined to wipe us out.
Yep.
The worst
They're
thing we
trying
did
to
in the
take our
80s
politics,
was start
they're
fighting
trying to
amongst
take our
ourselves. Because when we
funding, and
did
they're trying to
that,
take
we
our
left the
here.
pitch clear for Margaret
Yeah.
Thatcher to bulldoze her way through Labour communities up and down the country. And if we were to do that again, it would be unforgivable.
Well, Tony Blair said this weekend that Labour is a changed party in the space of 3 months. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I don't. I believe the party members are the same people they always were. And the people who've joined us share the same values. I believe, yes, the party is crying out for change. That's the difference. The party is fed up with the style of politics we've had for about the last 20 years. A politics that's kind of traded in small, gimmicky policies, retail politics, they call it. They want something bigger. They don't want to go to those doorsteps anymore and just be told, there's no point, you're all the same. They want a Labour Party they can believe
Jeremy
in
Corbyn,
again.
what kind of leader would you be with rebels, with people who vote with their conscience rather than with your party whip?
There's over 550,000 people and our members or registered supporters of the party, and I hope all the supporters become members so they can take part in the policy debates that come. The new leader, whoever it is, and there's no result yet, obviously, will have a mandate from outside the Parliamentary Labour Party.
From £3 supporters?
And members, and I'm saying that I want the supporters to become members, I really do. And there will have to be then policy debates within the party, and I hope there will be, and I hope we change our policy making so it's bottom up, not top
And
down.
MPs should listen to that selectorate, is what you're saying.
MPs, I'm sure, have been listening very carefully to what's gone on this summer because the numbers of people who've got involved in this election process are quite astonishing. And they're coming in because they want to see a party that's representative of them and their ideals of the kind of society we want to live
The
in.
Conservatives are going to force a whole bunch of votes very, very quickly in an attempt to wipe us out
and
over
I
the
think
next
Liz
5
is
years.
right.
We've got to wake
What
up to
most
that.
people want to do is to win again. Liz is right. What most people want to see is a Labour Party that's got its act together, is a strong opposition, but is ready to win
I'm
again.
afraid
And when they vote, that is what they will be thinking about.
We must leave it
Otherwise,
there.
we
Thank
let
you.
people down.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming here today and speaking so frankly. So that's it. 9 days left before the close of voting, with the winner to be announced 48 hours after that. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.